Globalization from below is a very different phenomenon from the globalization of international large corporations. But in many ways, it's just as important. And in this talk today, I want to talk about the social, cultural, and imaginative aspects of globalization through small-scale trade between China and Russia, and especially on their Northeast Asian border. And I'm going to emphasize two features. First of all, the crucial role of transnational mediators, who would be brokers, translators, frontmen for companies, patrons giving money, go-betweens with officialdom, those kind of people, because I think they make it possible to overcome some sharp differences of the business practices of Russia and China. And secondly, I want to talk about global brands, or branding in general, but particularly global brands, because these can function also as mediators between different cultures by referring to ideas of modernity or fashion or glamour that seem to dwell in the world at large. But I'll show in my paper, branding does not always work that way. So the overall aim of the paper is to show how transnational trade, which is often analyzed in purely economic terms, is also a key locus of social and cultural and moral confrontations. It's not always in agreement. And to do this, it's necessary for me to have some way to analyze the quality of goods. The quality of goods that does not reduce simply to the price of the goods. So later in the paper, I'm going to introduce the idea of qualia or qualic signs in order to discuss the ways in which people indicate socially what they perceive or maybe they misrecognize to be the quality of people and goods. So at the Sino-Russian border, we could say that two completely different civilizations face one another. But today the economies on that border are so intertwined that they could hardly exist without one another. And these activities on the ground are the product of local life. So in some ways they have a kind of friction with the hierarchies of the Russian social system, and they're also somewhat freewheeling element in relation to the top-down Chinese policies. So in a way they're operating a little bit on the edge in relation to national politics. However, we have to pay attention to national politics. So can I have the first slide, please? So here we have, as you all realize, a new diplomatic warmth of China and Russia at the state level. But the countries actually do have quite divergent priorities, and I describe the situation on the border as unstable because basically it has to operate in a deeply asymmetrical, changeable and multi-layered condition. So the first part of my talk is about this asymmetry of the border and a kind of caricature of what is going on. So can I have the next slide, please? This is the border I'm talking about. And the cities, I'm sorry this is very small, but the cities I'm going to be talking about are these ones like Manjuli on the edge here, and over there Cheche and Blagoveshchensk. So basically the Chinese government and local governments want to open up, but the Russian equivalents are not really more or less indifferent to cross-border trade, small trade, because they are focused much more on wealth-generating, long-distance exports of oil and gas and raw materials. And so they've allowed this kind of local economies in this region to more or less stagnate and decay. And the result is that these regions don't produce very much. They produce very little that the locals want to buy, let alone the Chinese. So the Russian residents in these areas are left dependent on Chinese imports for the great majority of clothing, shoes, domestic appliances, utensils, furniture, toys, mobile phones, and even fresh fruit and vegetables. So in the towns on the Russian side, there are Chinese investors and entrepreneurs who are quite active in construction industry, in agriculture, in catering, restaurants, that kind of thing, export of timber, export of scrap material, scrap metal. But a lot of that work is done quite quietly, almost semi-secretly, sometimes is illegal, and it's quite often in kind of opposition to the public pronouncements, which is we should be having Russian workers here and we don't want Chinese, that kind of thing. But on the other hand, compared to all of that stuff, small-scale trade, you can't kind of avoid it. It's out there in public. So we have street markets and kiosks and so forth. And because it's also very important economically, and because it forms so much of the materials that people buy in Siberian regions, it's sort of very much more present in the public mind, I think, than the more hidden kind of work that Chinese people do. And the other thing to note about it is that it provides a lot of work for Russians in a situation of unemployment. So most of this trade is done by shuttle trade, people going across the border carrying goods. And this is very helpful to the local economy. So if we're talking about visions that the Russians have of the Chinese, the main impression tends to be to ignore this hidden side of construction and so on, but focus more on Chinese as traders. So they sell, we buy, that kind of image. And that of course, is a very asymmetrical image, and it's reinforced by the fact that Russians don't see themselves as traders in China. So they're not doing the same thing in China. It's difficult to get permission for Russians to trade in China, the legal restrictions. They don't usually have the language skills and contact. So maybe because of this asymmetry, there's a kind of caricature that you find in public, which is in media and also in academic articles. So according to this idea, Russian consumers have a long Soviet socialist history oriented towards production, and therefore they are caring mostly about quality and authenticity of the goods. And they rate this higher than the price of the goods. Meanwhile, the Chinese business people are understood in this caricature to be very happy with copying, faking, and misleading the purchasers in order to get a high price. And this is not just a Russian stereotype, it also, you find it in China. I mean, there's a popular Chinese writer, Yu Hua, who has written some essays on Chinese copycats and bamboozling. Now, this caricature has quite a strong social presence, but I think it grossly simplifies and misrepresents the reality on the ground. For one thing, Russian traders are also quite happy to manufacture and deal in counterfeits, just like the Turkish or Chinese traders. And then on the other side, in China, there are quite a few diverse publics or communities that are very concerned with authenticity and sincerity, and they don't like fakery. And these groups would include people like rural farmers, for example, who've been documented by Susanne Brandstetter, or fashion designers documented by a book by somebody, Zhao. And then at the higher, more governmental level, a sort of ideological level, the government of China has been busily engaged in constructing a counter discourse, according to which Chinese migrants are to be seen as responsible pioneers of modernization in the world. Go out from China and go and modernize out there. And Russia is one of the places that's designated as a suitable destination for these modernizing migrants. Okay, so this is the caricature. I want to say a little bit about the actual situation on the border. Could I have the next slide, please? This is a picture of some of these shuttle traders. So people here are moving across the border with goods for sale, but under the pretense that they're for personal use, because that means they can avoid the customs duties. And that's quite an old practice, been going for 20 years or something. But other aspects of the border trade have been changing quite a lot. So just to give you a little history of what happened, in the 1990s in Russia, open-air street markets were judged to be disorderly, which is something I wrote about. And the local government separated them, first of all, ethnically, or you could even say racially, into Chinese market here and Russian market there. And in the Chinese part, there would be Mongolians, Vietnamese, other people, Koreans, not just Chinese. But anyway, the Chinese part was subjected to much greater police surveillance than the Russian part. More recently, the sellers, the stallholders, have been told to leave street markets and move into shopping centres, which are cleaner and provide more services. So could I have the next slide? So here's sort of remnants of a kind of street market, and behind is a shopping centre. And next one, please. And this is a bigger shopping centre in Blagoveshchensk, and behind it is a big hotel being built by a Chinese investor. So while all of this was going on in 2008, the Russian government cut to zero the number of permits allowing foreigners, mostly Chinese, to engage in retail trade. So what happened is that although there are some ways around this law, in many Siberian cities, the Chinese retailers have been replaced by Kyrgyz and people from other sort of former Soviet countries, who have some preference, they get preferential treatment. So there are Chinese businessmen, but they have to operate under a different face. So they would use Russian citizens very often as the front of their business, the public face, and selling their goods. So I think you can see that little history testifies to the continued resonance of this Russian view that the Chinese are sellers of low quality, fake, chemically polluted goods, and they do that in dirty conditions. So these days, even though everybody now is in these shopping centres, they are still in some cities separated. You have a Chinese shopping centre and a Russian shopping centre. And in the so-called Chinese shopping centre, there may be relatively few Chinese people because they can legally be present only as givers of work. They're not allowed to be there as retailers. But there's some interesting Russian work by Russian ethnographers showing that when the Russian shoppers go into these places called Chinese shopping centre, they still see it with the old eyes. They say, oh, this is like a bazaar. This is noisy, unclean, full of counterfeits, and so on. Now, Russian consumers are not limited to shopping in their own country, but they cross border frequently to China, And on the Chinese side, the goods are usually much cheaper. And here, I think the caricature that I mentioned is particularly far from reality. So in Manjuli and Heche, practically no street markets, and they've been replaced by boutiques and shopping malls. Could I have the next one? This is a big shopping mall in Heche, and the next one. This is a shopping street in Manjuli. So here we now have facilities for shoppers, restaurants, coffee shops, tailors, escalators, changing rooms, signage in Russian, clean toilets, all that kind of thing. And in this environment, the Chinese retailers are trying to reorder their relations with the Russian customers, and they want to project a new kind of rule-bound image. And there's some recent work by a German ethnographer, Dieter Stern. I don't know him, but very interesting work, recent work from Manjuli. In 2013, Manjuli, this border town, was designated by the Chinese government. It was called a civilized port of national importance. And this declaration was associated with developing the northern border and including enhancing the tourist industry to make the city attractive for international tourists and Chinese tourists. And a key word in all of this is civilization, Wenming. It's key to the way they're trying to attract tourists, because these are supposed to be people from the relatively prosperous middle class, the embodiment of this kind of Wenming values. And so meanwhile, there's been a reorganization of the economy, so the previous small kind of haphazard little businesses are now regulated and linked into a sort of vertical hierarchy of businesses. The shopkeepers have to pay high rent, so if you've got a shop in one of these streets, it's expensive, they have to pay big taxes, they have to follow the government regulations, and all this means they cannot run this kind of bargain basement operation any longer. So they have to raise the quality of the goods and the prices. So what happens when the Russian customers come into this new situation? It seems from recent work that in many cases they still tend to adopt the default mode, which is suspicion that they're going to be defrauded in China. Could I have the next picture? Here's some Russian people shopping in Manjuli. So they tend to carry on with the notion that this is like a kind of bazaar in some way, an Oriental Bazaar. They tend to laugh at the price named by the seller, and then they bargain. They give some very, very low, insist on some very low price. And it seems also from the ethnography that this is not what they do normally. If they're in Russia, in Moscow, or some Russian city, they don't bargain generally in Russia. But it's a practice that you do when you think this is an Oriental person I'm dealing with. And so there's some interesting studies of the language used by Russians in relation to Chinese, using a familiar form of you and this kind of thing. And I think it's possible that this kind of behavior reflects much earlier asymmetry on this border, which is basically a political asymmetry, which existed in the Soviet period, when the Soviet Russian communists were the older brothers, the guides, the more progressive people, the more advanced leaders, whereas the Chinese were understood to be the followers and the learners. And I think it also, so it reflects hangover from that, and I think also the linguistic asymmetry, which is basically that for the last 100 years or so, it's always been the Chinese who learn Russian and the Russians who basically don't bother to learn Chinese. Today, however, it's a very interesting and significant situation because those old asymmetries are reversed economically because, of course, China is economically much more powerful. And so what happens is that it seems the Chinese salespeople, now they take offense at all this. And so they say that actually the Chinese don't care about quality, they only care about price. And they see the Russians as rude and lacking in Wenming. And they regard it as insolent to name such ridiculously low prices and insisting on doubting the authenticity and quality of the goods when in fact they've much improved. So they try to insist that the prices are fixed. And I think here it's also important to understand that many of these traders in a city like Manjuli are themselves quite well-educated people, maybe quite middle-class people who take up work in a shop for a period of time and then they hope to make some money and then go and have some different kind of life. So all of this relation with the consumer is a matter of self-esteem for the people working in these shops. So, because bargain inevitably lowers the status of the seller, because the understanding is that the first price they gave is not the right one. So they're really trying to insist on fixed prices. And I think this kind of goes together with this new governmental status of the town of Manjuli, and it goes with a whole sort of impetus to eradicate the sort of disorderly image of the border, of the frontier, this kind of marginal place where, the laws never quite worked. I think the goal now is to eradicate the difference between the centre and the periphery as much as possible, and to reinstate the kind of respectability of the Chinese radiating from the centre. So I think you can see that in this situation you're likely to get misunderstandings, and it seems that there are sometimes between Chinese and Russians angry scenes, and a significant number of transactions are broken off. So I think this indicates the need for mediators in the Chinese borderland cities, but even more so inside Russia. Because in Russia, the Chinese are not really passing kind of shoppers and purchasers. The Chinese there are entrepreneurs and investors and providers of work. And so they require much greater integration into the local socio-economic and political scene. And I would argue that these mediators and middlemen are not just necessary for the Chinese to operate in Russia, but they're also linked in much longer chains that connect these remote areas of Siberia with the global economy. And I'm afraid I have to leave out a bit of this paper which was describing these global links just because it's getting too long. Anyways, I think there are three types basically of Chinese businessmen in Russia. The first dealing in raw materials, then in provision of services, and then the sellers of consumer goods. And they all need mediators to be successful. And empirical studies have shown that they all use the same mediators. So all these three types of people. And these mediators then become a kind of elite of quite informal yet authoritative leaders. So despite the fact that the migrants from China to Russia come from different parts of China, and they don't live in a kind of Chinatown inside Russia, there's no sort of little enclave just of Chinese people. Nevertheless, they do form a community of sorts because they're dependent on these mediators. they tend to have very few formal institutions, unlike other migrants in Russia, migrants, let's say, from Kazakhstan or Uzbekistan or something, who have associations to protect their rights. The Chinese, I think, have been more or less prevented from doing this by Russian regulations. They don't really want the Chinese to come together in one group. So, on the whole, they rely on informal networks and personal relations. Next picture, here's a sort of mediator type with some Russians. So these key mediators, there are three kinds mainly. Firstly, old Chinese settlers who would be people whose ancestors migrated to China before the revolution, and they got citizenship and their descendants living there. Secondly, Chinese men who marry Russian wives and they get citizenship that way. And thirdly, Buryats from Xinjiang in Inner Mongolia, that's in China, who have rights to return to Russia because their ancestors emigrated from there. And all of these people, I think, are more trusted by the Russian officials than some recent migrant from China. And in the words of one local resident, the mediators have become somehow Russian. So they have Russian habits, Russian ways of speaking, fluency in jargon, Russian food they eat, and they seem at least partly kind of one of us. So if you want to know about what they do, they keep up relations with, they're based in Russia, but they keep up relations with Chinese officials. They help the groups of shuttle traders go through the customs. They deal with terribly complicated Russian legislation, and they smooth the path with the Russian police and so on. But I think it's important for my paper that they do much more than that, because they are involved in the economic transactions. They hold meetings to bring buyers and sellers together. They would ensure that contracts are fulfilled and even conclude the actual economic deal if the Chinese side, the investor, the Chinese partner, is prevented from coming to Russia. The mediator can take their part. So many of them have become powerful and wealthy. And crucially, I think, they have the role of guiding the direction of Chinese business in their area, their local area. So they decide what kind of product lines to encourage, who can trade in what goods, who should not be allowed to compete because somebody else has got that niche. They perceive market opportunities, and so they can have new ideas, and they can invite investors from China to put money in. So I think these multiple functions show that the mediators are not just at the surface level of trade, but they're also involved creatively in ways that reach quite deep down into the production and design of the goods. So they're quite crucial agents, I think, in pushing or instigating the range of goods, the physical characteristics of goods that are sold in Russia, the quality standards, and the marketing for Russian markets. And so this turns me to the subject of creating the image and the saleability of goods. And so I'm now going to move to talk about brands in the context of these Russian and Chinese economies. So Lash and Lurie, who are two authors, argue that goods, when they become commodities, they're all alike. So iron is iron, potatoes are potatoes, and as commodities, they're different from brands, because brands are distinguished above all because they promote difference and from one good from another. But I think that when we are in these kind of border situations, the difference between a commodity and a brand kind of breaks down, especially where you have very strong negative stereotypes, like I've described, where the notion of a brand and the notion of the country of origin kind of more or less merge together, the same sort of idea. So if we think about the idea of a brand, it's a broader idea than a trademark. So a trademark is the registered label or logo of whatever it is, Nike or Coca-Cola. But the brand is a bigger idea. And if we take it down to the real basics of a brand, it's evident, I think, that even a commodity, like vegetables, can become brands, kind of brands. So I'm going to give you an example. Russian shoppers in the town of Blagoveshch on the border have a prejudice against Chinese cucumbers, or Chinese cucumbers, and they recognize Chinese cucumbers by a little stem. Can I have the next picture? That is a Chinese cucumber. Now, they prefer to buy the Russian cucumber. Can I have the next one? The Russian cucumber, which has no little stem, because they are convinced that it's produced in ecologically healthy, good conditions. So this tiny little distinguishing mark of the stem is enough to create two brands of cucumber. So you go to the market, you say, I want Russian. Of course, in practice, it doesn't take long before a very perceptive mediator comes along and says to the Chinese, well, cut off your little stem, and then you can market your Chinese cucumbers as Russian cucumbers. Do you see what I mean? So I think this story illustrates one aspect of brands. They're kind of abstract ideas that are applied to objects, and these objects then exist as them, whatever the actual content or origin. And I think in this case it's worth noticing that the brand sign of the stem on the cucumber indexed something invisible, because it referred to the supposed process of production of the cucumbers. In other words, if you've got a stem, everybody thinks this is chemically impure, and no stem means ecologically good. But it's otherwise completely not evident. But although it's invisible, I guess that if you've bought the right kind of cucumber, the knowledge of which one you're consuming maybe affects your experience of eating cucumber. So it's been argued by Lash and various other people that in a world of ubiquitous brands, all around us there are brands, what consumers want is not functionality but experience. And so we have what they call the experience economy, which I'll talk more about later. Anyway, we have these brands, you all know, Coca-Cola, Apple, Prada, and so on. They circulate through the world, endlessly copied and mimicked. So I think another thing worth thinking about is that you can describe a commodity as something that's simply produced. You produce whatever it is. But a brand is also a source of production, because it can manifest itself across a whole range of products, and it can serve to create transnational links through projecting desirable images in quite diverse spheres of the economy. So in this way, it's been argued that the brand penetrates across the boundaries that divide regimes of value. For example, the different economies of, let's say, America and Africa. So the argument is that global advertising campaigns provide the possibility of a sense of belonging to this kind of shared, imagined community of worldwide consumers. We have the same experience. But, I mean, when we look at our border, Russia and China, I think this is really too easy an argument, because even this little case of the cucumber must make you pause for thought, because here we have this embryonic branding, but it just seems to divide the market. So already in the late 1990s, early 2000s, Melissa Caldwell was noting the influence of nationalism on consumption in Moscow. And so she studied primarily food, but she observed that we have these locally produced elements of Russian cuisine which competed with foreign foods but also imitated them. And she notes that there was a kind of buy Russian campaign from Russian officials, and soon after this campaign was launched, practically everybody, farmers, manufacturers, purchasers, shop assistants, they were collaborating somehow in classifying goods as nash, ours, and ni nash, not ours. And then they would describe the local products as superior in terms of taste and quality and healthfulness. And usually they are very often marketed in nostalgic kind of images of, this is Soviet sort of way we did things, or this is the way grandmother makes her kefir, or something like that. And of course, though, this was a very contradictory picture, because very often the same people who would say we like this home products would also be buying international products and accumulating them and so forth. So it's deeply contradictory, I think. But the important point, I think, to note is that even in either case, if you say we want only national or we want international, the branding is recognized by the public to link up to wider economic and political differences. So these very categories of ours and not ours indicate that people are comparing, and in the case of foreign goods, like you could say Japanese cars or Marlboro cigarettes, they're using the brands in a way to imagine and compare much more than that particular good, but a whole system or way of conducting your economy or set of ways of living. And quite a lot of these images of what the brand stands for are mythical, really, like Hollywood or Paris or something, things that people don't experience directly. And I think possibly, this capacity of branded goods to stand for countries, in other words, to participate in international relations, could be a factor in, for example, the recent closure of McDonald's in Moscow after the crisis in Ukraine. So if that's in Russia, let's meanwhile think about China, because here too Western brands of food and clothing and home furnishings, etc., have been very popular. So the next slide, please. For example, this global brand of furniture, IKEA, opened a store in Shanghai in 1998, and it's copied all over the place. This is a copy of an IKEA store. And so we have all this kind of thing. People are now very accustomed to experiencing what they prize very highly in these kind of places: reasonable prices, contemporary payment methods, so you can pay by card, individualized, personalized service, delivery of goods to the city, and guarantee of satisfaction, or you get your money back, that kind of thing. So they like all that of the international brands, but there is also, like in Russia, a very strong movement to create Chinese brands that compete with the international companies. And so I referred already to the study of the fashion industry, but it's a very good example. The Chinese fashion industry has a very accurate picture of global fields in haute couture and pret-à-porter and sort of ready-made clothing, fast fashion. And they have very clear idea how to strategize, how to find a niche for the Chinese products in these fields. And they're deeply concerned to challenge the idea that Chinese clothing is unoriginal and cheap and so forth. So there seems to be a general goal of modernity, but modernity is not identified with westernization. That you can have a Chinese version of modernity, which they construct through essentially a historicizing of the process of the development of the fashion industry. So they see it in terms of the evolution of Chinese culture over time. So modernity is not something out there identified with industrialization in the West or anything like that. It's something that comes out of Chinese history. And so in the sphere of clothing, you have feudal clothing, and then you have so-called traditional clothing and movement towards openness, and then you have fashions moving, and the kind of golden age, which is kind of coming when Chinese fashion is sort of right at the front of modernity. And the idea is that your clothing is not just a thing you put on, but it is a reflection of a moral and spiritual outlook of the wearer and their sophistication and their distinctiveness in the way they live. So I think we can see that in both Russia and China there's a move towards creating national brands that can be seen to emerge from their respective histories and the values in each country. And well, I think that's the case, that's what I'm trying to argue. However, that does not mean that these carefully designed national brands travel well in the global environment or across their mutual border. So I just want to think a little bit about these brands at the border. So brands have a place in the total retail market, which comes about because not all things are branded actually in practice or branded in the same way. So I think on both sides of the Russia-China border, in trade centres and shopping malls and shopping streets, you can find a range of different kinds of goods. Could I have the next one, please? I hope maybe it's a bit difficult for you to read this. Anyway, at the bottom there's a cheapest level of clothing, footwear, cosmetics, not labelled, not branded. Then there's goods provided with some kind of meaningless logo, which looks as though it might be a brand, but nobody really thinks it's a brand. Then you have better quality goods, which are labelled with a Russian or Chinese brand, or Vietnamese or Turkish, sort of something people vaguely recognize as a brand. Then you have pricey copies of international brands, but made in China. And then most expensive of all, you have genuine branded products made in Europe or USA or Japan, and maybe one or two from China. And then finally, I think it's worth mentioning one significant category of goods I'm going to discuss in a minute, which are very cheap items, but they've got international branded names prominently displayed. So anyway, in the period 2010 to 2014, I think in the border towns, basically retail trade is still dominated by the cheap, unbranded products aimed at a low-income purchaser. And these goods are a kind of, you've probably seen them all, it's a kaleidoscope of indescribable stuff. All of them a bit different. They come from who knows where it's made, in every shape and size. They're all different. yet they all seem somehow the same because they're all bundled in together. Each little shop, they all have mass of the stuff. Now it seems that Russian incomes have been increasing, and the consumers don't like to admit they're buying these kind of goods. They're aiming to move up the scale and buy at least locally appreciated brands or goods that sort of seem to be connected with international brands. And brands have become very important, it seems, in the contemporary Russian culture, maybe more so than Europe. And they're very closely studied for the image they will project. So I've been told that Russian shoppers will generally choose a high-status brand, if they can, the appearance of high-quality goods, but they don't care too much if it's actually a counterfeit. But the main thing is, this is to quote somebody, we all want to look good, to be stylish and tastefully dressed. This is normal and right. We long ago stopped buying simple things, simply a shirt or simply jeans. We buy brands and the style put into these things. Fashion and brands rule contemporary shopping. You might not like this, but that's the way it is. So that's a quotation. So what is implied when people are talking this way about style and taste? So the next section of this paper is about qualia. Now, there is a literature on brands that focuses on semiotics, the meaning content of a brand or a trademark. But there's a different literature that emphasizes not really information so much as the broader aura of feelings and physical sensations, emotions, and moral landscapes. And interestingly, this dimension comes not from academia, but from the practitioners of marketing. So there's somebody called Mark Gobbe who designed the emotion-driven brand strategies for Coca-Cola, IBM, Versace, and Starbucks. And he wrote about this. It's crucial the brand focuses on the most compelling aspects of the human character, the desire to transcend material satisfaction and experience emotional fulfillment. The brand is uniquely situated to achieve this because it taps into aspirational drives that underlie human motivations. So this is the practitioner of marketing. And I think in this kind of area, the idea of qualia can be very helpful. And qualia is a philosophical term used to refer to instances of subjective conscious experience, like if you have a headache, the pain of a headache, if you drink wine, the taste of the wine, or the perceived redness of a sunset. Those are kind of classical qualia. But anthropologists have recently used this idea to suggest that we could look at it not just as an individual, subjective mental experience, but also a kind of socio-cultural event. And so somebody who's discussed social qualia in relation to the Cold War, Russian qualia in relation to the Cold War, she wrote, they are matters not of so much of unmediated sensation, and nor are they just symbolic constructions. What we have here is merging of qualic signs like the saltiness of bread or the shine of an eye with histories and taxonomies, with bodily apprehensions of people and of geopolitics. So what she is trying to do here, which I think is so useful, is to link this completely physical sensations or sort of physical emotional sensations associated by a group or community of people or culture with some object, and link them to much broader histories that they associate with these things, or geopolitics. So the idea somehow here is that these qualic signs establish a relationship between the person experiencing them and the image. And I think we could apply this idea to branding. So just very simply, the example of a Marlboro cigarette that provides a certain taste sensation, but at the same time, because of countless media images, it puts the person smoking the cigarette in a relationship with America, the Wild West, the cowboy, and so on. And that relation can be felt to be quite intimate, but at the same time, it can also be seen as a huge gap, in space and time. And so, proceeding from that, I would like to make the argument that these qualia are intrinsically equivocal. That they can be both close and very distant. And the more the consumer is aware of the fact that media are manipulating them, that there's a story here, that some kind of emotion is being put on you, the more the music is trying to play on your emotions, all that kind of thing, the more conscious they are of the space, I think, that they're here, and that there's some projected image there. And then if they're aware of that distance or that gap, they also know that they themselves have an opportunity for mockery or subversion of the image. So in other words, in the contemporary media-saturated world, I think that distance and alienation and self-reflexivity are all part of the art of consumption. So let me now try to ground these general points in specific Sino-Russian trade with a few examples. I'm going to start with the more positive end of this thing with Dolce and Gabbana. Could I have the next picture? Here they are. So we have a website, and with these very glittery frocks and shoes and handbags, they represent the essence of La Dolce Vita. Now this brand is very popular in Russia, and there's several stores and boutiques in big cities. And there's quite interesting interview with the Dolce and Gabbana designers when they came to Russia to open their latest store. Because in their view, the Italian and the Russian sense of beauty is the same. So there's no need for them to create some special designs for Russia. So Russian women just share in the same aura of beauty and elegance as the consumers of Dolce and Gabbana in any other countries. But what do we find in the Siberian border cities? Because here, of course, there are no actual licensed Dolce and Gabbana boutiques. But nevertheless, the brand is consumed, and in a particular way, which I think can be seen as ironic. Could I have the next one here? And I hope you can see this. This is a Dolce and Gabbana underpants at a market stall. And so it's Dolce and Gabbana make all kinds of stuff, everything you can think of except perfume, clothing, and so. But they do not actually make male underpants, and especially not pink ones. Now, I think in this situation it would not be right to call these fakes, because really nobody is pretending they are the real items. I think what is happening here is basically playful, a kind of humorous thing. And so there is a kind of transnational message of this brand, which says it's elegant and so on, and it's European. But surely this adding it to these waistband of these underpants is kind of tongue-in-cheek or cynical. Nevertheless, we could see it as a kind of maybe example of what I discussed earlier, this literature which suggests that brands are kind of linking cultures around the world. The logo kind of is stuck on there on the waistband. I think it works because it's decontextualized and it fits with the notion of the brand as a sort of mediator bringing together different cultural worlds. You have Chinese, Italians and Russians. So here we have Chinese traders selling Italian underpants to Russians. So I think, though, that if we try to think about a shared imaginary meeting place for direct trade between China and Russia, it's much more difficult. Because after all, if you think about it, all food is either Chinese or Russian. There isn't really a sort of, almost impossible to think of a sort of mediator. And a lot of other goods are in languages or traditions that have been separated for decades, if not for millennia, medicines, books, painting, and so on. There may be some areas of culture which are an exception, like popular music and sports and art, but by and large, if Chinese producers are wanting to sell Chinese goods to Russians, they have to design them for Russians. They have to say, well, we're not going to sell actual Chinese goods, we're going to sell our goods for Russians, or at least they design the marketing for that specific audience. But if you brand goods to a particular market, it's apt to fall afoul, to have problems because of these Qualic effects. And I think this is especially likely to happen in cultures as separate as the Chinese and the Russian. So now I want to give an example of I'm really nearly end of my talk now, of a video advertisement of a Chinese mobile phone for the Russian market, this Huawei new smartphone, which is called Honor 3, which was posted on the Russian YouTube. I'm just wondering, should I describe this first and then you look at it? Because it's a little difficult for you all to see it, so I maybe describe what this video does. So it came out like a week ago. It was instantly very popular, so 1 million viewers in a few days. And the film depicts a band of Russian kind of mafia types, and they're torturing a businessman to try to get him to repay a debt. And so they've tied him up, and they're threatening him, and they're lowering him into a great vat of water. And he is screaming for mercy. I didn't know, no, I didn't. I'm not guilty. So they lower him in the water, and then they pull him out of the water. And as he comes out of the water, his phone rings in his pocket. So the bandits take an interest, and they say, so your phone is waterproof? And he said, yes, it is. So how many megapixels? 13, he says. And so then they forget about the debt, and they throw him in the water again, and the gang has great fun with his phone, and they take some selfies. And then the film ends with the boss. He rings his girlfriend and tells her in melting tones, I found just the phone for you. So this is the Chinese ad for the Russian market. So I just, nearly at the end, I just want to analyze this. So I think what's interesting about this brand promotion is, first of all, it indicates something about how Chinese manufacturers imagine Russia, although it's kind of humorous, obviously. And second, I think it's interesting that Russians obviously kind of respond to it, because 1 million immediately watched it. But I think the most interesting aspect is that maybe why the Russians watched it is because they have a self-reflexive fascination with how they are portrayed by foreign media, foreigners trying to sell stuff to them with their stereotypes about Russia. And so immediately after this thing, this ad came, they developed a website which analyzed the images of Russia in international brands. And this was one of them, but there were 10 other brands, Nissan and Audi and Nike and so on. And so the idea of the website is, what are Russians trying to say about us that they're not really saying, but that you can see through looking at their branding. About this Huawei phone ad, the Russian website commented that, clearly the underlying message is that Russia is ruled by violence and brute force. But in fact, the ad is using qualia, dark colours, growling voices, the terror of the businessman, the threatening kind of music, referring to an image of Russia which is in fact not seen by the consumers as referring to themselves. Since, and we can see this from the website and the comments on the ad. The website said, the Chinese have used an image from the 1990s. It's a historical period, nothing to do with us. 1990s days of the mafia. And the reactions of the potential customers, they kind of quite admired the film. It's a well-made film, but they distanced themselves from the message that everything in Russia is decided by force. So some commentators were really angry. They said, idiots, you Chinese, we'll wipe out your phone and crush them with a bulldozer. Others wrote, don't be so angry, you should learn to appreciate humor. Other ones wrote, don't buy this phone because look what kind of people like this phone. And another one congratulated the Chinese media for overcoming the problem that the name Huawei sounds like a Russian swear word. So what I'm suggesting here is that many Russians have become very aware of themselves as targets for branding. And this has given rise to a very sophisticated understanding of what a brand is and what a brand does and how you could resist these negative images. And I have an example of this, but I'll just end the paper now. So to conclude, I've tried to describe the consequences of the asymmetry between the Chinese and Russian economies as they affect trade and migration. So I've argued that different cultures and memories and habits are just as important as the differences in economic resources and organization. And first of all, I showed the necessity for mediators, which basically are needed when you have Chinese urged openness and expansion and Russian countervailing forces on security and limits to migration. So I tried to show how these go-betweens have become a powerful elite in border cities. But then I also tried to show that they are not the only mediators and that international brands can sort of act in that way. These are brands that are owned neither by the Chinese nor by the Russians, but somehow they mediate between them. But I then tried to show that these global brands are also liable to subversion, and they have to share space with national and nationalistic brands that are being developed in each country. And then my final argument was that when Russians and Chinese try to sell things to each other, and mostly this is Chinese selling to Russia, there are real pitfalls, there are really possible problems. And some of this is due to the fact that there are widely circulating stereotypes or caricatures that they have of each other in each country. So in a media-savvy world where we have immediate reactions, this thing came out a week ago and already 1 million Russians and all these reactions to it, we have these immediate reactions. They're also very contradictory reactions, and people are very sensitive to what brands are, what brands are doing. I think the results for trade are very unstable and difficult to predict. So,